I'm speaking from Idaho Falls, Idaho, where I'm actually with Christopher Tapp, who was exonerated just yesterday, or day before yesterday. And TrueAllele was used in his case. It wasn't the key evidence in his case, but cybergenetics was nice enough to process his case for us, and really to show that Chris was not on any of the pertinent evidence. This case is not in your slideshow, but if you go to BuzzFeed today, just look up Christopher Tapp and BuzzFeed. It's a great article. New York Times has some color stuff on some of the stories. So if you Christopher Tapp, I particularly like the BuzzFeed article, but there's a bunch of others. And I'm going to talk about how we started to use TrueAllele, why we started to use TrueAllele, and how I think others can use this software. And if you if you can mute your phones unless you're going to ask a question, because I hear a little bit of shuffling around or something. So if you can just mute your phones until you are ready to speak, that would be super. So the first slide that you have, I think, is a very important slide in my life, because I was at one of the forensic meetings, and Rhea from Cybergenetics saw me, and I'd been talking about some exonerations there. I can't remember if it was American Academy of Forensic Sciences or the Promega meeting, and Rhea was telling me about this TrueAllele software, and I had heard things about it, and I think had reviewed it somewhere, but I didn't know much about it. And so she started talking to me, and she said, well, you should talk to Mark Perlin, who was a few tables down in this little break area. And so I went there. I'm talking with Mark, and he's saying, oh, yeah, we can look at data below the cutoff, below the laboratories RFU cutoff. And I was indignant. I was angry, even, because I'd seen so much shenanigans done with mixture interpretation, and by shenanigans, I shouldn't use that term. What I mean is so much indeterminate work that was testified to as if it was a clear determination of an inclusion. And I thought, this is just going to make things worse. Now, if they can go below their cutoff, they'll be able to find anybody in the noise. I mean, if you look at the noise, we're all there. All the peaks are there. And Mark stood up for his product and his science. And if you know Mark Perlin, he can do that very well. And I like to say it almost came to two academics throwing pencils at each other. I was so upset. But Mark did what a good scientist should do. He provided me with his papers, and I promised to read them indignantly. But I did promise to read them, and I did read them. And as I'm fond of saying, a great theologian should be judged by their willingness to die for their ideas, and a solid scientist should be judged by how easily they let their ideas die. So my idea that this was improper in some way or not pertinent to my work of clarifying a mixture interpretation was wrong. I was wrong. Mark was right. But, he may not always be right. Okay, slide 2. I should tell you that the way that I got into this mixture question, I've been doing casework since about 1999. I'm a university professor. I've never worked in a crime lab. I've had to visit a few, and everybody's been very nice to me for casework. And many of the people I went to school with are working in labs, and we've consulted over the years. And but with that disclaimer, I'll say that as an academic, I saw a big problem in the mixture interpretation in cases I was dealing with. When I first went to a talk, and I think it was Bedoli who was speaking, I asked whoever it was from the FBI at the first AAFS meeting I went to, what's the error rate at the FBI laboratory? And whoever it was who represented the FBI lab said 0. And I laughed and said, "Where did you get such a small ruler?" The problem in forensic science, one of the problems in the 90s and into the new millennium as well, is the um, lack of really good error um, detection and presentation in casework. And I think everybody's trying to address that. I don't mean to say that I was the first person to think of this. But what my lab did was, I have a case, Kerry Robinson. We have used TrueAllele. We're waiting for the outcome. I've been working on the case, 12 or more, 14 years, I think. And in Kerry's case, there's a mixture where he was included by the analyst of the Georgia Bureau investigation, but with the now, I think, 20 analysts who've looked at that, only one agreed with that original analyst. And so Ithiel Dror, who you may know, is a cognitive neuroscientist in London, and I did a study where we took the DNA evidence from Kerry Robinson's DNA mixture case, a sexual assault with multiple perpetrators, semen mixture, and we gave it to 17 analysts in another crime lab in another state, and we didn't allow them to talk to one another, because you shouldn't. If the science is solid, you can tell if you're an expert if the dipstick says someone's pregnant or not. And if mixture interpretation was solid at that point, then we should have gotten one answer from everybody. What we got was all three possible answers. The suspect is included, the suspect is excluded, it is inconclusive. 13 of the 17 analysts excluded Kerry Robinson's profile. 3 were inconclusive, and 1 agreed with the original Georgia analyst. Well, we published that in a peer-reviewed journal, and it got press in The Economist and New Scientist and other places. But there was still a big problem, and a lot of people downplayed our small study. So NIST, in 2013, National Institute of Standard Technology, did a bigger study. And John Butler's group had done these studies before, as many of you are familiar with. But this time, and I talked to John about those studies, and I thought that they were okay, but they really didn't give context. It really wasn't like a real case. This time, in 2013, Butler and his group, and Mike Coble, I think, was one of the chief scientists on this, put together 5 scenarios that were kind of realistic case scenarios, the 5th one being the most difficult mixture. And this slide now says mix 13. In case 5, they had a mixture and gave it out. It was a ski mask from a bank robbery that they had created this mixture in the laboratory. This is everybody knew this was a difficult case they were handing out that was created. And they had done webinars before with all the labs to make sure everyone took it seriously, and they really did. And this is the result. This is one of Mike Coble's slides. I saw this talk given in the Czech Republic, Florida, Atlanta. It's given all over the place. And this slide was always included. And it shows that in mix case 5, this ski mask case, when this supplied 3 suspects, A, B, and C, labs got A and B right. They were included. C, however, suspect C was not included in the mixture. 76 of the accredited crime labs who were involved in this study from North America, 76 out of the original 109, I think was originally, included suspect C, included and gave a statistic. Now, this is, they were supposed to do this according to their protocols and take it seriously, and this is exactly the type of thing we found in our smaller study, that in complex mixture cases, qualified lab scientists, good, honest, hardworking lab scientists were guessing incorrectly and were able to calculate statistics for these incorrect guesses. Now, this was a difficult case. The point of this, according to Mike Coble in his presentation, was to see how many labs would just say, this is too difficult, let's call it inconclusive. And how many labs would take a stab, and how many of those who took a stab got it right or wrong. And what they found out, I don't think it was their hypothesis. I'm sure they were as shocked as a lot of people that 76 out of 109 labs got it wrong by falsely including a suspect. So this, to me, was solid proof. This, in conjunction with our study, what I had said, that mixture analysis was a disaster. complex, three or more persons. It doesn't mean they got it wrong every time. Remember, this is the fifth case. This is a difficult one, but I'd go for 20% of the time. I'd go for 10% of the time, 5%, 1%. How many thousands of cases is that? Most cases are mixtures, especially with our new sensitivity. So I was very concerned about this, and Kerry Robinson was my first reason to be concerned about this. And I was convinced by Mark's study, the Virginia study, because in, I can't remember how many of the cases, it was one or two cases, I'm sorry that I don't remember, but when he worked with the lab in Virginia, they, the analysts had included a couple of people in some mixtures, and then TrueAllele excluded them, and then the analyst agreed with TrueAllele. And I thought, whoa, this might be a way to get to the truth in some of these cases that I'm reviewing post-conviction. And the first one that we tried it on successfully, and it was the first one we tried it on, I believe, was Pinkins and Glenn in Indiana. This was Frances Watson at the University of Indiana Law School. She had come to me, and we had this complex mixture, again, multiple perpetrators, sexual assault. There were 5 suspects initially. There was DNA done. The woman said that the assailants wiped semen on her sweater. There was, in fact, semen on her sweater. She said they all did this, and it was multiple men in there. The state lab was able to pick up 2 profiles in this very early DNA case. And, this is 29 years ago. And these 2 profiles that were picked up excluded all of the suspects, including Pinkins and Glenn. These were guys driving home from their work at the mill, and the car broke down, and, they had to walk away from the car with a gas can. Somebody breaks into the car, steals their coveralls, which they reported, and then use those coveralls in this raid. And because the name of one of the guys was associated with these coveralls, they became suspects. So that's how they got in, which is a reasonable way to start an investigation. However, the DNA excluded them, in my view. When TrueAllele analyzed this, they were able to get down to the 5% contributors. So I think that might be in the next slide. Yes, TrueAllele's Pinkins findings. So Daryl Pinkins was the last one of these men, the 2 men who were convicted. He was the last one left in prison. Roosevelt Glenn got out, not through a declaration of innocence, but he had done his time and got out on parole a couple years before. And what TrueAllele was able to do was go down to the 5% contributor level, and that, in addition with some other evidence that we had, could exclude all 5 suspects. The state had not been convinced that Pinkins and Glenn and all the other suspects could be excluded from that little bit of noisy stuff we see at the bottom of every paragraph. And after Mark Perlin, I was able to do this. I did this case pro bono, I believe. That report was submitted along with my report. And I told Frances Watson, we just have to wait for the science to get better. And the science got better with this product. And the prosecutor went to the lab and talked to the lab in Indiana. We were flying out Friday for a Monday hearing on this. All it was a DNA hearing. We finally got an evidentiary hearing. And Friday, the prosecutor decided, no, on Monday, I'm going to let him go. And we all got that call, and I got to fly in and be there for the very happy moment. So this was the first case where we established that probabilistic genotyping, and in particular, TrueAllele, which is the only one. I mean, I've worked with Bulletproof a little bit, and I've had to review star mix cases. We've reviewed a couple of the other new products as well, but really, TrueAllele is the only one I've used in casework on my own, and we were able to prove that it can clear up these historical mistakes. So after that, there's another article when DNA is not the gold standard. I'll go to the second case, case 2, Gregory Hobbs. So what I did then to get funded in 2016, I believe it was I wrote a grant to the Department of Justice that we would use TrueAllele to evaluate cases in Idaho and other places to see if people's claims of wrongful conviction were validated by TrueAllele, or if the convictions were validated by TrueAllele. And we got $670,000, which could pay for a bunch of tests through TrueAllele and my lab to get these cases and for the investigations. And then we got into a hang-up because our Attorney General in Idaho wouldn't sign the required statement by Department of Justice that Idaho takes reasonable efforts to collect and preserve biological evidence in murder and forcible rape. And so we were not able to use this in Idaho. But I was able to get 3 other states' attorneys general to sign those forms with the help of innocence groups in those states. So Illinois, Georgia, and Montana were part of this grant. And now I need to say that the Department of Justice does not endorse any product, certainly does not endorse any opinions or views that I have, and I'll continue with that. So as we're working, I'm talking to other innocence organizations, and every year we have a meeting, and I told the directors I have this money, and I'll tell you that there was controversy about this as well, because many of our people come from the defense community, and there was a feeling in the defense community that the probabilistic genotyping was being used to just prop up statistics to astronomical levels, and because they had complaints about black box programs, etc. I think there was a lot of resistance, and that resistance went pretty high up in the Innocence Network. I brought Dr. Perlin to a talk I was supposed to give for the Innocence Network in 2015 or 16, and was reprimanded by some of the more illustrious members of those organizations that I belong to. In any case, the thing I asked at the directors' meeting of the 65 or so projects who were represented was, do you have any cases like Pinkins and Glenn that can benefit from this type of analysis? So in New Mexico, even though I couldn't use the grant for it, they were able to obtain funds for analysis by cybergenetics. And but I had analyzed the case, and I was allowed to testify on behalf of that analysis done by cybergenetics, in addition to the analysis done by my lab without probabilistic genotyping. And Gregory Hobbs' conviction of manslaughter was overturned by the judge from the original trial when we showed the TrueAllele analysis. And that's because this was a case where the judge had asked the state's expert, well, is there a greater than 50% chance that, that this person was included or was included? Of course, experts can't testify that way. And it got confused, and we finally ended up using TrueAllele, and Gregory Hobbs' conviction was overturned. It's not part of the grant effort. All right, there's Gregory Hobbs in the next slide. He's still in prison at this point. I had just testified. And the question in this case was, Gregory Hobbs shot a man, and the question was there a struggle with the gun? And the lab, the state crime lab, correctly decided to swab the injection port, and found out that the injection port did in fact contain the victim, and so it looked like there was a struggle. But again, the judge, because of his decision of how to restrict that evidence by percentage of conclusion, the expert couldn't testify properly. And with TrueAllele, we were able to show that the victim matched, and it was a 10 million match statistic. So Gregory Hobbs was cleared. And then the next slide shows some of the great folks from the New Mexico Innocence Project. They're the ones who handled all of the legal parts of this case, and really deserve the credit besides the software. And I just wanted to have the And you can read the details on the slides. These slides were used at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. All right, the third case. So I hope this is giving you some idea of how this can be used both to identify perpetrators, and I've showed you how to exclude, but I want to show you a case now that did both. It excluded two men who had been previously convicted and who spent 20 years in prison, and then helped identify the new person. This case, case 3, is the Montana Innocence Project's case that we joined with at the Idaho Innocence Project. In 2018, we were able to go to court, and it was remarkable. And Dateline was there. They're going to do a 2-hour show on this, I think. I hope they get it right. They often do good work. Absolutely amazing case. There's a 1994 murder. 2 men are accused. The father-in-law of one of them sees the advertisement for a reward. I think he was actually in a jail cell at the time, and calls in and says, I think my son-in-law did this with his friend. One of the 2 men gives an incriminating statement, and I have to tell you, about 25% of the time, there's a self-incriminating statement in exonerations. I don't think we can imagine the pressure that's put on by the state. Christopher Tapp, who I'm with, you can read about what would happen to him in an interrogation. He implicated 2 of his friends and himself in order to get immunity and not get the death penalty, and it was all untrue. And DNA finally found the right guy in that case as well. But in this case, these men end up being convicted, claiming they were innocent. And in 2014, the Montana Innocence Project and my lab in Boise State joined in post-conviction. And this one, we did use the Department of Justice grant to cover a lot of the expenses, including the TrueAllele analysis. And though that, again, is not an endorsement by the DOJ, but I'm telling you the truth. Because of that, we were able to get really good DNA from a piece of ligature, if you go to the ligature slide, that was found near the body where the body was dumped. The victim is wrapped up in similar twine or cheap stringy rope. And what was found on there were the victims found in a bloody portion, and then where we thought the hand might have been, where it was wadded up a little, of the perpetrator. We got a DNA profile, excluded both of the guys who were in prison, and it provided a DNA hit to the man who's in the yellow jumpsuit in the next slide. And not only that, but this man's nephew in the next slide testified. This is Fred Nelson talking about his uncle. Gosh, I can't remember his name right now. Anyway, that his uncle had been grooming him since he was a boy to be a criminal. They got in some trouble. And the nephew, when he got in trouble, in order to get out of this program he was in, he had to write all his crimes down and give it to the warden. And he wrote that his uncle had killed a woman in Montana, in where actually mentioned where this crime occurred, and said he got away with it. And then 2 other times, Fred Nelson talked about David Nelson, his uncle, and went to the police and said, hey, my uncle's now saying there are 2 innocent guys in prison serving for this, and he's laughing about it. And have you done anything? And he went a 3rd time and said the same thing. He's saying that this woman who died up in Helena, that he stuck a hammer in her hand, and graphically describes how he pulled it out as this woman's pleading for her life. Nothing was done by the police. Nothing happened until the Montana Innocence Project took the case, and we were honored to work with them. And then you see Friday, April 13th, 2018, the next slide, 2 of the lawyers flanking Fred Lawrence. Okay, so I think we had proved that this technology could work now in both directions, and certainly TrueAllele has been used by prosecutors all over the country to get convictions, or however you want to say, process evidence successfully to implicate people. But we've shown that it can in fact, just tells the truth. Next case, case 4, Johnny Lee Gates. This is another one under my grant, and I work a lot with the Georgia Innocence Project. They are the ones who now are helping with Kerry Robinson's case, the one I've talked about that started all this, and we hope Kerry will have a successful exoneration soon. But in this case, this is Johnny Lee Gates. He had admitted to murder. He has a lower than average mental capacity as measured by the state's test. In fact, that's the only reason he's not dead. The state convicted him of murder, got the death penalty, and was going to execute him until somebody said, you realize he has some mental deficiencies, and the Supreme Court had ruled at that point, actually the state court of Georgia as well, that you shouldn't execute people who have mental deficiencies below a certain point. And Johnny Lee Gates was at the border, and there was an agreement made finally that they wouldn't execute him. So he was in since 1977. He is still in prison, even though through TrueAllele analysis, and this is one of the cases, this one like Pinkins and Glenn, where only TrueAllele analysis really resulted in the exonerations. Nothing else had worked. And believe me, we worked hard, certainly in Pinkins and Glenn. This case I only spent a couple years working on, and we knew from the beginning that we would have to get some sort of statistical analysis on the data. But in any case, it was TrueAllele. It was through the Georgia Innocence Project, the Southern Center, and Boise State University, my lab, that we were able to get a DNA hearing. And the judge in this case relied on the DNA to overturn his conviction. So what were the issues in this case? Next slide, post-conviction issues in Gates, mental deficiency. He was brought to the crime scene for his confession. They had him touch items at the crime scene. And the prosecutor struck all black jurors, not just in his case, but in many cases in this county. And the DNA on the ligatures, there was a belt from a robe, and the woman's either ex-husband or separated husband, I can't remember, I apologize. But anyway, his tie was also used in her murder. And what about this question of race? Well, if you go to the next one, there's a table there. This was done, I think, by the Southern Center. And it just shows that in this county, Muskogee County, the capital cases, when there was a black defendant, they struck all the black jurors in all these capital cases. Well, why is that? Well, because they might be sympathetic to a black defendant. And further, there was an N written next to all the black jurors' names. They got the notes in discovery from the prosecutor and saw this and reported on it. There's a W next to the white people. Okay, next slide shows the ligature. And if you can see it there, this is what was used to get the evidence. It was analyzed at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The data was sent to cybergenetics, and they did the analysis on this case. And I believe that, yes, Dr. Perlin testified in this case. I did not testify in this case. And the result is on the next one from the Georgia Innocence Project case. He's now been 41 years in prison. His conviction is overturned. So why isn't he free? Because justice moves slowly. The state's appealing, and we'll see what happens. But I'm hoping that Mr. Gates will be home free. There's a slide there, my happy vanity slide with Claire Gilbert of the Georgia Innocence Project, who I work on a lot of cases with. But I want to emphasize that the analysis was done by Dr. Perlin and the testimony by Dr. Perlin in this case. And also I show a clip in there from I believe from the Associated Press that are some of the notes that were discovered with the N written next to the jurors. Now, even though the judge clearly understood that this was a violation of due process and would have, I think, liked to have decided on that, for some reason, legal time, I'm not sure what it was, this was not able to be considered grounds for overturning the conviction, and it was purely DNA. And again, I want to emphasize that this case, as in Pinkins and Glenn, it was the analysis by cybergenetics that provided the evidence for exoneration, and then Jenkins and Lawrence also. I'll just stop there. Sorry. Great. That last slide, diligence, dedication, devotion, was for the forensic science meeting that I was at. That was the theme. And I was asking, well, what is diligence, dedication, and devotion? In the Taft case that I'm here in Idaho Falls for, my comments on the courthouse step yesterday was, the light's got to shine in both directions. We can't say we're going to use better practices to go into the future and do this right. You also have to let the light shine into the past, show where these techniques can be used to free people. And there's only a few jurisdictions that are using their probabilistic genotyping software to review old cases. I think this should be a national priority. And it wouldn't take long for a lab, and Dr. Perlin has generously offered to help labs do that. And he said he could run it without cost to them. I'll let him speak for himself later. But to review labs' old mixture cases where there are credible questions of inclusion or exclusion that could not have been addressed by CPI or other methods that were attempted in the past. I think we have a duty to do that. And my very last slide just thanks all the great people who worked on the cases with me. And I've tried to point out that these were all collaborative with local innocence projects in various states. But for my lab, John Luca Perry and Karen Rudolph worked on it. And then our Idaho Innocence Project, volunteer lawyers. The Southern Center for Human Rights was the Gates case. The Montana Innocence Project, Jenkins and Lawrence. Frances Watson was at Pinkins and Glenn. She was the chief attorney on all those cases. The GBI processed much of the evidence, as did the New Mexico Department of Public Safety Forensic Laboratory. They did Gregory Hobbs' case, and the expert from the lab testified in agreement with the findings from TrueAllele, and deserves much of the credit. In fact, the judge credited that expert and didn't like my testimony, but I had said bad things about the judge's forcing testimony on percentage, which is just not the way we do things. And the Montana Forensic Science Division lab worked on Lawrence and Jenkins' evidence and did a wonderful job. And in fact, in that case, they excluded and they were able to get the hit. So TrueAllele was just kind of icing on the cake in that case, but very important to my work. And then the project grant and the actual disclaimer that the Department of Justice asked me to give each time. And it's basically they're saying, hey, you can be honest about the products you use, but you can't pretend that we're endorsing anything. So I don't want to make that claim. I also want to say that I have not thoroughly analyzed any other probabilistic genotyping software. I'm really not an expert on the comparison, but these are the cases that I've worked, and I've been trained in TrueAllele, but all of these were processed by cybergenetics using their own software. And I'd be happy to take any questions.